little bit about myself. My name, again, is Ian Terry. I am one of the principal consultants here at IS Partners with a explicitly information technology and cybersecurity background with nearly a decade's experience in IT just in general, and certainly a number of years performing consultancy, independent attestation and validation, and IT compliance work as well. So as far as our agenda today, we actually have a guest with us, Cole Medin, who I will ask to introduce himself right now. If you're able to, Cole, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Ian. And hey, everyone. I'm super glad to be here. My name is Cole Medin. I am a generative AI consultant. And before that, I was a cloud engineer. So I've been in the tech world for a long, long time now. And once generative AI started to really kick off in 2022, I started putting all of my effort there because I really saw that as the future for the whole industry and honestly the world. And so I have a YouTube channel where I teach about everything generative AI, both like super technical things and also a lot of no technic or non-coding, not as technical stuff. And so I cover so many different tools and frameworks and libraries and applications you can build with AI. And so I have a lot of experience with what goes into the decisions behind a lot of these different tools and frameworks. And that plays in well to what we'll be talking about today, because focusing on compliance within artificial intelligence, there's a lot of, you have to pick the right tools and right frameworks to be compliant. And so that's where I bring a lot of expertise to the table. So I'm looking forward to talking all about it.
Likewise, Cole. Awesome. So general high level agenda here. We've gone through introductions. We're going to talk about understanding AI security risks, right? What are some of the things that we just want to be aware of, both developing as well as utilizing all of these awesome solutions, technologies, and services that the AI world has kind of thrown us into. From there, we'll go into the concept of navigating compliance requirements and frameworks. There are a couple in particular I'll kind of get into, and we'll be able to kind of pick Cole's brain a little bit to get some insight, kind of some insider insight on how different methodologies and approaches for how you're going to utilize AI or even develop it could have some pros and cons as they relate to just general best practice, general cybersecurity concepts, as well as mapping those and satisfying specific compliance or framework requirements. From there, it's an open season on some other concepts. I'd love to get your sense, Cole, on some developer perspective on what secure AI really means. Talk about any kind of emerging cybersecurity threats. What does the future of AI security look like compared to what it's like right now? And of course, we will also have some opportunities for some questions and answers for those who are attending. So AI security risks. I think generally, a lot of the baseline cybersecurity concerns are always going to apply here. In a lot of ways, they're just increased exponentially in some ways in the context of AI. So all of your basic concepts, phishing awareness, security awareness and training, passwords, multi-factor authentication, we already know how they apply in so many ways to our day-to-day. I'm sure everyone cringes at the thought of having to MFA into another website or application. But with the emergence of this new technology, these new solutions, I think it's kind of a wild west. It's a new frontier in understanding how some of those conventional cybersecurity controls need to be applied to these new environments, and the type of impact that the threat landscape out there could have on our companies and our AI tools and solutions if they were to circumvent our controls or take advantage of a vulnerability or something like that. Cole, I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, kind of like on the inside there, what are some of the major AI security risks that you have been seeing in the different industries you work in that are kind of top of mind for companies out there right now? Are there any good examples, you think?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple big ones right now. The first one is that a lot of people, when they're looking for the best ways to use AI in their company, they want to develop some sort of knowledge base where they take a bunch of internal documentation, SOPs, revenue reports, any kind of information internal to the company, and they want to use artificial intelligence to answer questions over their documents. It's kind of like a big use case you hear about, like chat with your PDFs, for example. It's essentially like that, but taking it much, much further to be able to feed in like hundreds and hundreds of documents into an AI system and ask questions about that kind of thing, summarize meetings or get insights into your data, all of that. And the big problem with that is that you're sending all that data over the network in a way that you usually wouldn't until you first started to, look into this AI use case. And that's a problem because, as we know, anything that goes over the internet can be intercepted theoretically, no matter how secure your protocols might be. And it ends up in another company that has that information now, even if they say they're not going to use it. There's still risk with that. So that's a big one that's out there right now. A lot of companies, they have compliance requirements to not use a lot of the popular large language models you've heard of, like Claude or GPT, because if you are creating this kind of internal knowledge base to use with artificial intelligence, you can't just send all of your company data to that other company, like OpenAI, for example, the creator of GPT. So that's one big one. Just one other one I'll touch on really quickly here is a lot of artificial intelligence systems are able to do code execution now. And what I mean by that is it can generate code or accept code and actually run that code without your approval or without you really knowing what's going on behind the scenes. And the reason that's dangerous is because of something that's kind of been in the industry for a long time. It's the concept of like a remote code execution vulnerability. And so if you create a system where you have a large language model running on your machine, for example, that is able to execute code that users on your platform submit, they could theoretically submit malicious code that when it runs on your software would like pull your database credentials and send it back to them, as just a random example. And so you have to be really, really careful. Like, you want that power of the AI being able to run code on your behalf. There's so many really cool use cases with that. But at the same time, you have to make sure that your code that you're accepting in to run is sanitized or controlled in some way. So it can't just do whatever. So yeah, that's another big one that's happening right now in the space.
Those are two awesome examples, and I think your latter one about the arbitrary code execution, it kind of goes back to what I was saying. It's a lot of these vulnerabilities and these threats to AI are ones that are reminiscent of those we've already been dealing with. It reminds me, your example reminds me of SQL injection, right? Where if you're not doing things like parameterizing your fields in your web application, right? People can, rather than insert, month, day, year, right? They're putting in SQL query commands, right? And if you're not
Right.
appropriately kind of parsing or linting that code when it's getting sent, you're kind of able to query the database directly, without actually any authorization or authentication. So it's definitely fascinating to think that same concept could be applied here. But going back to your first point, is rather than tapping into maybe like a specialized database with a limited data set, something's very context specific. In the landscape of AI, we're talking about massive quantities of data that are really all just kind of commingled into kind of one big space, that have been labeled and have different attributes assigned to them, right, to create the different relationships. But, rather than just tapping into a specialized database with a SQL injection, you're tapping into a massive, not necessarily context dependent, just huge population of data, which,
Mhm.
is a significant risk to an organization. And it's kind of a challenge for them because really the only way to tap into all of the features and functionalities of AI is making sure that it has access to as much data as possible, right? To derive those discrete patterns, discrete relationships that humans wouldn't be able to do without the use of those types of technologies. So I think that the appeal for all of that functionality is what is overriding or circumventing the kind of gut instinct of a lot of companies, because they know, hey, sending a bunch of our data, our personal or private intellectual property, our sensitive data, over to someone like OpenAI or any, third party, or even general, just having that live together presents a lot of risk to the organization. And those are already there's already been some attention around that in the context of something like population health, where we're dealing with a lot of like PHI that has like anonymization and all of these processes that attempt to sanitize that data. That same degree of sanitization, we're still trying to figure out, I think, how best to apply that, to these AI data sets and things like that. But again, that is where companies are probably wrestling with the challenge, is like there's so much benefit out there using these types of systems. We need to figure out ways how to get our data out there, mitigate the risk to ourselves, and still get all those awesome functions and features. So, great AI security risks. I think also something that we could possibly talk about here is, interestingly, how AI itself almost presents a risk to the landscape of cybersecurity in companies, because I know that threat actors are utilizing AI in a lot of ways to kind of come up with solutions or come up with attacks, right? Or exploits, right? Kind of going back to, the earlier days of hacking, there was this concept of like script kiddies, where you didn't actually have to know how to code or anything like that. You just use someone else's script that they put together and just apply it to your own circumstance. But Cole, maybe you could talk about, if you're familiar, some of the like the AI solutions out there that threat actors are using to come up with their own attacks.
Yeah, so if you just try to ask a large language model, like, help me create a script, just like a script kiddie would do, to execute some sort of vulnerability attack, it's going to say no. Like, the large language models are trained to not help with that kind of thing. What the problem is, a lot of the concepts that go into creating that kind of script, like remote code execution, for example, there's other use cases that you can ask the LLM to help you create that kind of implementation for, and then you could then use for some sort of malicious attack. And so a large language model, even though they try to make it not helpful for these kind of things, you're still going to be able to have ways to get it to help create code to help you execute on these kind of these vulnerabilities. And even if you know how to code, it's still going to make the whole process faster of getting things up and running. And that's the big problem, because, like, I mean, a lot of people know how to code, so it's not like it's a huge deal that it can create this code, but that it can help you do it really quick and iterate on the things that you're trying to make. And I haven't tried to make any of these malicious scripts with AI, but I know that it's possible, just because there's a million different ways out there to, eh, you know, perform these kind of attacks on systems. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think you also even raise another kind of AI security risk that's pretty unique, I hadn't thought of, is that concept of, AI, open AI. They know people are going to try to do things that they don't want them to do on their platform, right? They have those
Hmm.
controls in place. They have the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not. But people are pretty clever, right? They've come up with these ways to kind of reframe the context of the question, or get
Right.
the AI session to be kind of thinking it in a different context, where it's actually more willing to participate in thought experiments or provide code that, even though it's going to be used maliciously, the AI doesn't really realize that, because they've kind of recontextualized the discussion, right? And I think that concept is called, like it's almost like jailbreaking the AI system. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and, like, there's some really, like, clear and kind of funny examples of that. Like, I'm comfortable sharing this example specifically because this is not possible with LLMs anymore. But, like, a couple of years ago, if you asked a large language model like GPT 3.5 Turbo at the time, if you asked it how to make a bomb, it would not help you make a bomb. But if you got it within this mindset where it's thinking it's helping you with a chemistry class, so you say, like, I'm a professor in a chemistry class, and I am teaching students chemistry through making a small bomb for fun, as an example. Surprisingly, that would actually get the large language model to be willing to help you make a bomb, which is a crazy example, super stupid. You can't do it anymore. Like that kind of level of control, and you can't trick an LM like that at this point, which is why I'm willing to share that. But there's still kind of that to an extent. And it's a lot more difficult to, as you said, Ian, jailbreak a large language model, but it's still possible. And that's
Mhm.
a big risk right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And going into one of our next topics is that with the prevalence of these technologies and the usage in both like the private sector as well as in the public sector, there is a response from the compliance community to come up with standards and cybersecurity standards and frameworks to apply to the use, development, um, et cetera, of AI systems to try to mitigate the risks associated with that. And I just really want to quick highlight two examples for our listeners that are kind of the front of mind for me. Are the NIST AI RMF, or the AI Risk Management Framework, and the second one being the ISO 42001 standard. Both of which seek to address some of those risks and some of those factors that we talked about, again, for companies that are developing or utilizing AI as part of their business processes. Um, the NIST 800, or sorry, the NIST AI RMF, NIST being the National Institute of Standards and Technology, already major players, especially in the domestic, federal, and Fed adjacent space, GovCon or government contractor space as well, having come up with standards and frameworks such as 853 and 800-171, which were essentially like awesome control by control libraries and approaches to ensure that your cybersecurity program has specific controls and mitigations in place. And as a result, in response to this AI boom, they've come up with this AI RMF risk management framework that doesn't necessarily have specific controls like 853 might, but more so as a framework in terms of how you can identify and categorize and group and ultimately mitigate risks presented to your organization via the use of AI, and also manage the risks associated with developing it such that you're ultimately aspiring to this concept of a secure AI. On the flip side, ISO, that's the International Standards Organization, little more popular to use their standards for international, not non-United States types of business relationships and standards. They're best known in the cybersecurity community for ISO 27001, which is a international standard for cybersecurity adopted by many private entities that kind of want to facilitate business securely internationally. Again, they've come out with this 42001 standard, again, looking to identify and mitigate the risks associated with using and developing AI. And in that case, actually a few specific controls that could be implemented to kind of control those risks, just as some examples. So I just wanted to do a quick little, summary of those two. And in fact, we've got a separate video that viewers could look into specifically about the AI RMF. Very highly encourage you to look into that. I did it with myself and Jenna Andrews, another member of my team here at IS Partners. But Cole, I mean, in your experience, and you can be candid here with the different organizations you're working with, or even, maybe your own pet projects, et cetera, have either of those frameworks came up in conversation, like, or is anyone kind of thinking in that way yet?
Honestly, not that much. And that's why I'm so interested in being a part of this webinar, is because there's a huge need for that. People aren't thinking about it enough. And sure, there are definitely companies that are thinking about security within AI, but they're not thinking to the level of like a framework, and they don't really, for the most part, even understand like what goes into making AI secure and compliant. They just know they have to. It's like that kind of thought that's bugging them in the back of their mind, like, oh, I probably shouldn't be sending this information over the internet to OpenAI, for example. But a lot of them do it anyway for now, and they need to not. And that's why I'm excited to be diving into this.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a feeling you would respond that way. That tends to be my experience too. And I think it's kind of a mix of, things are so early that, it just hasn't had an opportunity to kind of promulgate through industries that you can utilize these types of frameworks to at least identify, if not manage, the risk to your org by leveraging these tools or developing them. I think that probably is really it, and that's why it's an awesome opportunity for those who are tuning in, to kind of just get a first blush at some of these awesome frameworks that are out there. It's not like people haven't come up with some really mature and good ideas around these concepts. Definitely something that I would advise, uh, you know, even if you're not developing, just utilizing, one or both of those frameworks, not only to provide an internal assurance, mitigating risk, et cetera, but also to demonstrate to your partners, your clients, et cetera, that you're already thinking in that direction with respect to the risk of AI, right? Especially if you yourself offer an AI powered service, you could get ahead of the curve a little bit by thinking in this way ahead of the competition by adopting or implementing or even getting a certification for the ISO 42K1 example that'll kind of put you ahead of your peers in a lot of ways because you're putting security first, which for a lot of companies out there is probably going to become more and more prevalent, concerns around security. Like Cole, how about, maybe not necessarily specific to any of those frameworks I exemplified, but what are some of the conversations that you have with your clients and your partners when they are conceptualizing a secure or an AI deployment or using an AI model? What are some of their initial thoughts around like their concerns or their cybersecurity concerns?
Yeah. So for most companies that are really starting to realize that there's a lot of risks that they have to look at, a big consideration is moving to actually running the large language models and associated infrastructure themselves. So instead of relying on third parties for the large language model, for the database that houses that knowledge base that I was talking about earlier, actually like having that on their own infrastructure. Because that way you can actually have a lot of sensitive data or intellectual property that's fed into these systems, and there's no risk, or at least the risk is extremely minimal, that would actually be leaked in any way, or that there would be any unintended consequences from just operating with all that data together in one place. So that's a big thing right now, and it is possible. It's very, very possible to run extremely powerful large language models on your own infrastructure. Even 2 years ago, it wasn't really realistic, but it's getting to that point now. And there's still a huge discrepancy between the power of these massive closed source models running in the cloud, like GPT from OpenAI. But that gap is diminishing really quickly between those models and the ones that you can just go ahead and download right now and run on your computer, have it running entirely locally. So nothing you give to it goes anywhere outside of your computer. So that's a big consideration of companies right now is like just thinking about how do I actually run all this myself? And it's challenging. These services out there in the cloud, they make it really easy for you. Having to think about your own infrastructure and setting it all up and maintaining it is difficult, but a lot of businesses are realizing it's necessary for compliance, for security, just to mitigate risk in general.
Yeah, and I know that's a major part of kind of your expertise, right? Is aiding companies in architecting and understanding how, can rather than leverage these very known third party providers where we don't have, they're kind of like a black box, right? In so many ways, they not only how the
Mhm.
actual model is working and how it's coming to its conclusions, et cetera, but even the infrastructure and the architecture on which it resides, right? Other than maybe some independent assurances that they might get from those third party providers like a SOC 2 type 2 report, they, for higher sensitivity data or larger companies that maybe don't even want to take that gamble, sounds like, that is where you come in and you aid in architecting that local deployment of those types of architectures.
That's right. Yeah, that's where I focus a lot of my time and energy, both when I'm educating others, like on my YouTube channel, for example, and also like as I'm working with clients and even building things myself. I'm focusing a lot on local AI. I mean, really, that's probably like the part of generative AI as a whole that's just the most interesting to me because there's so much power given to you when you can run things yourself, not only from like mitigating risk and the whole standpoint of everything we're talking about here, but also just because there's a lot more customizability. And not to get into this too much because it's a little off topic, but even being able to like fine tune a model, for example, you can give it your own data to train the behavior of the model in the way that you just can't do with something that's given to you as a black box without your ability to control it. So there's just so many cool things with that. Yeah, I mean, it's my thing. It's my jam right now.
No, that's awesome. I think it is fascinating, like just like you said, 2 years ago, right? This would be like unheard of for a company to kind of think in that way, to like, we're just going to be responsible for architecting, deploying, and managing, all of our AI infrastructure. What kind of
Mhm.
developments have occurred over the past couple of years that make that so much more accessible?
Yeah, so it really comes down to just the technology advancing in the way that like, people have figured out how to train the model, like how to make them much, much larger. So there's the concept of parameters, which is essentially all these little dials that you have that when you train the model, you tweak all these little numbers. There's billions and billions of them for the larger models. And all of those numbers, it's pretty magical. I mean, even like the top AI researchers don't understand how tweaking all these little numbers is actually what gives it the intelligence that it has. So essentially, you have like 7 billion or 32 billion, or with GPT-4, you have 1.8 trillion of these little numbers that all combine together to give it the intelligence it has. And I mean, even to me, that's like mind boggling how you can even make that connection from tweaking numbers to all of a sudden being able to answer like any question better than Google can. But that's where we're at now. And so people have figured out just how to do that better and faster so
Hmm.
that we have these models that are very powerful that don't have to run on a $100,000 architecture you have set up in a data warehouse. You can run it on. I mean, there's even getting to the point where there's some pretty good models that you can run like on a phone. There's been a lot of like news release recently with Meta, for example, like creating versions of their models that can actually run on a phone. And even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that kind of model would have to run in a data center.
Yeah, it's wild how efficient some of those new things have gotten, and I think that
Mhm.
how that benefits really all industries is that they kind of have a choice now, right? Is that we don't necessarily have to restrict ourselves to this black box that's provided as a service. We are able to kind of come up with these things and build them internally, rather than just put all of our trust in a third party entity to do all this work for us. Now, it's almost kind of like a number of years ago when the cloud, going to the cloud, became a big deal. There was the migration to the cloud. This is almost like the diaspora from the cloud, to, maybe still it's in the cloud, but away from the, third party service provider AI models. It's just like, we're going to do this
Mhm.
ourselves. But, maybe you could illustrate what that would look like. I mean, is this, in your experience, are you seeing companies set up these types of local deployments like on known CSP platforms, or are these things they're running out of their own like internal data centers? Like, maybe if you could illustrate that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's really all of the above, but generally it's going to be some sort of cloud provider, like a VPS that you have running. Because even though that like you're still using a third party, like technically you're still using a third party to host your models when you have it on like an EC2 instance in AWS, or you're running it on like a droplet in DigitalOcean, just to name a couple of providers. Like you have some machine in the cloud essentially that's housing your model, but it's still much, much more secure than going out to the OpenAI API to make your requests to GPT. Because in the end, when you're running the model on your machine, even if it's hosted in the cloud, it's your machine. And there's not data transfer happening like from your instance hosted in the cloud to that cloud provider. Like they don't get to peer into your instance like OpenAI gets to peer into your API calls and get
Mm,
all the information out if they
right.
choose from what you send into it. And yeah, there's also companies that host it entirely themselves in like a data warehouse that they have. It's less common. I mean, like you said, Ian, like everyone's moved to the cloud over the last 5, 6 years, and so people have specifically gotten rid of their data centers to move to the cloud over the last half decade, and so people aren't going to like go back just for AI when it's still very, very secure to just hosted on the cloud machines, like they've been doing with all their applications that they've started to host in the cloud recently.
Yeah. And I think, ultimately, like there's kind of there's two approaches that one can take, and there's not necessarily one better than the other, right? And I think that's something I want to kind of highlight or reinforce here, is that for
Hmm.
many, even most companies, probably using that trusted third party service provider to provide the AI to you is probably just going to be what makes sense, right? They don't necessarily have a need to architect and host and manage their own infrastructure. For those scenarios, that is where things like SOC 2 reports or ISO 42001 certification, right? These independent attestations or assessments, something that gives you as a company a degree of assurance that someone like OpenAI or another entity has done some type of cybersecurity or internal controls assessment and audit, so that you're not totally trusting whatever they're doing without any degree of assurance, right? And for most companies, that's probably going to be sufficient, at least in the near term. But it sounds like, a lot of the clients you deal with have a little more of a specialized need or a higher degree of concern around maybe the data itself, or the impact if there were to be like a breach situation, not only in terms of any types of like financial impact, but really just almost like a public relations impact for something like that, right? It sounds like those are some of the attributes of
Mhm.
your clients that push them just like, hey, we've got a higher maturity need for sensitivity and control here. We're going to move away from the open AI. We're going to go with our own local deployment.
Right. Yeah. It typically is a data privacy concern. Because if you
Mm,
have anything that's sensitive, like if you're trying to create a system to help you with budgeting using historical data from your quotes, as an example, or like you want AI to help you answer questions about your revenue, like all of that is just using like proprietary data. Or if you want a coding assistant where you want to feed in your code bases for your company, that's intellectual property. Like there's
mm,
so many examples of these things, but I appreciate you saying this, Ian. I definitely don't want to make it sound like it's all doom and gloom with OpenAI and
right.
Anthropic, those companies. Like you never want to use them, because there's definitely a time and place to use these models for two reasons. First one is that these massive closed source models like Claude 3.5 Sonnet, GPT 4.0, they're the best. You can't compete with them with a model that you have running locally, because the
Mhm.
infrastructure, for one, the infrastructure would be way too expensive for almost every single company. And then also, like I said, they're closed source. You can't download them, even if you had the infrastructure. And so, if you want the best of the best and your data isn't sensitive, it actually does make sense to use these platforms. And the fact that it's a black box can still be kind of scary. And so, it really is up to your business, your team to figure out what is best. But, like, as an example, if you're running an e commerce store and you want a customer facing chatbot that has knowledge of all your products and can recommend products to customers in a chat widget, that's not sensitive data. Everything that you're feeding it there is something that a user could find themselves. It's just saving them time by giving them recommendations. And that kind of system, I would highly suggest just using a third party like OpenAI or Anthropic for that, because it's just not sensitive. And there's a lot of examples like that. And for your business, there might be use cases that go both ways. And so a hybrid approach is really the most common, where you're going to have parts of your system like customer facing AI chatbots, everything that's front facing, to be using the more powerful models just because you can. And then for the things that are internal, I mean, like I said, the gap is diminishing quickly between the models you can run yourself and the massive closed ones. So there's still going to be a lot of power you can have, but then you still have the data privacy for more of like the internal applications for your company using AI.
Yeah. And all of those thought processes, all of those considerations, they really characterize and illustrate the things that you just gone through, that risk identification and risk management approach that any company should take, should apply to how they're going to use or develop AI, right? And that goes back to me suggesting leveraging some of those frameworks or those certifications to kind of guide that process. The NIST AI RMF or the ISO 42K1 if you need an actual kind of certification. Both of them are risk-based approaches where you go through the activity and the process of considering all of those different factors, right? What is the sensitivity of our data? What are our resilience requirements, our SLA requirements to our clients? What kind of impact would a breach have on us? Maybe it wouldn't be that severe, right? Maybe it would be a massive deal. But kind of what's interesting is just all of that, the determinations around that strategy for AI have that risk informed approach that should be there at the beginning. And then you kind of go from there based on those determinations, right? And both of those elements are baked into those awesome frameworks and standards that I love to exemplify. They kind of begin with that risk identification, sensitivity analysis, what characterization of our business, what we're actually doing, and then make the decisions based on that, rather than find yourself in a situation where you've all in a certain approach and then didn't realize, oh, wait, this actually wasn't the right fit for us. Maybe we didn't have any risk at all. We could have just been using, an outsourced model, or maybe we didn't really consider that we could have even gone with a local approach, and we actually could have used one the entire time. So again, just reinforcing that concept that using that risk-informed approach, preferably one that follows a specific framework, is the ideal way to go. Cole, I'm curious, in some of your experiences, like when you go into an org and have those initial conversations with them about their AI strategy, do you ever find that there is a mismatch between like the risk to that organization and their existing strategy, kind of like I exemplified, where it's just like, oh, hey guys, you should have been local. You need to be local ASAP, considering all of these factors, right? Have you ever had a situation like that come up?
Yeah, definitely. Not with people that I've worked with directly. I've been fortunate where people I've interacted with more like closer level, like actually consulting for them, they've kind of had the right idea. But I've definitely heard of people like just that I'm talking to in conversations through my community and stuff where they're a part of a company or they ran one at one point that was not doing it the right way. Like they they had a lot of really sensitive data, like their own intellectual property is usually one of the more common ones that they're feeding into closed source model. So they're just sending it away. The most common use case that I've seen that should be local that isn't is generally with code bases where they'll try to have a large language model help them continue coding on an existing code base. And so they're sending in like a ton of their scripts or components or functions or whatever. And like that's intellectual property. And it's not like as risky as sending in like client data with social security numbers, obviously.
Hmm.
But like there's still a risk there of just sending your I mean, a lot of times the code bases, if you think about just the value that you paid developers over the years to build this up, it can be worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, even if it's not like a billion lines of code, even if it's just like 20,000, it can still be worth a lot. And so you're sending that over the internet freely, and it's just not the best idea.
Yeah, and you're taking what are potentially unique and novel, functions, right, and essentially giving them into the platform for that to then use to inform its responses across all of its user base, right? So you have the threat of kind of giving away, your secret ingredient, and everyone else just gets it whenever they kind of try to ask for the same type of function or solution to a programming challenge on their end, right? Is essentially what you're saying, is like your IP is being used to inform future responses from that service.
Yeah, pretty much. And a lot of the larger models more recently have come out saying that like they don't use your data to train their models anymore. So it's less of a risk, but it's still your code that's existing in a second place in another company. And there's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be risk to that, even though it's a lot less like OpenAI says they don't train on your data anymore. It was the case like back in like 2021, 2022, where they would. But now they say they don't. And like I trust that. I think it's hard to
Me,
tell though. Like it's a
it
black
is
box,
hard
and you
to
don't.
tell, and I
Yeah.
generally am one to give them a benefit of the doubt, right, and
Mhm.
kind of trust them to, when they say things like that. I think that it would be pretty risky just for how ubiquitous and how wide of a an impact it would be for them to,
Hmm.
undermine or essentially lie to their consumers, that would be pretty substantial. So I'm sure that they have
Yeah.
gone through that and say, hey, are we sure we're being truthful here? But
Right.
nonetheless,
Right.
there are things that, are out of OpenAI's control, something like an
Hmm.
insider threat, who has the keys of the kingdom. He's already been with the company forever. That could happen to anybody regardless of their intentions, et cetera. And that's a great example
Right.
where that intellectual property scenario, they're not using it to train the model, but they've got it out there, and it ends up being a data breach scenario that all the controls in the world couldn't mitigate or prevent. Right? It's always
Hmm.
a question of when, not if. Right? Any good cybersecurity professional will tell you. So
That's right.
want to leave just about 10 minutes here for some Q&A, but I don't want to I do want to touch on, got this concept here in the agenda, the future of AI security. I mean, I certainly have a sense of what it looks like from my perspective, and it definitely involves the adoption of some of these frameworks, these certifications becoming more relevant in order to kind of function as an AI provider or utilize AI internally. And in my opinion, are also probably going to manifest initially in that public sector, that GovCon sector, where federal entities are going to want to take advantage of all of these features and functions of AI, but they're going to do it, with NIST 853 or something comparable slapped on top, so that whatever they're going to be using will be, as secure as they can essentially make it if they're going to start using those types of tools. And I tend to think that the AI RMF is probably a little preview of the type of thinking they're going to apply if they were to come out something with a law comparable to FISMA, the Federal Information Systems Management Act, right? And that is what ultimately made so many agencies as well as contractors adopt NIST 853 controls. There's probably going to be something like that for AI, maybe not imminently, but give it, 5 years or so. And I think that those companies that get in and start using something like the NIST AI RMF now are going to be better prepared when that shoe drops, and something like FISMA is enacted. So that's my perspective on the future of AI security. I'm not sure if you have anything on the developer side, anything new that's coming out, or new thoughts or concepts that are emerging that will illustrate or characterize our future of AI security.
Yeah, so a few thoughts that I have. First of all, on the regulation side, there's going to be a risk for the next while here. I mean, really, this could go on forever, where there could be an issue that comes up that's so large with the big closed source models like OpenAI and Anthropic that there could be regulation that gets put down so hard on these models that like companies won't even be able to use them. And that's kind of like a very doom and gloom kind of like it probably won't happen, but there's a possibility, to the point where I know of a company that I've worked with that is actually planning on building their own transformers. And transformers just like the architecture for the big generative AI models that you hear about. They're building their own infrastructure to run their own large language model, not even just downloading one of these open source ones that I've been talking about, but even to create it themselves completely and train it with their own data, because that's the only way to truly hedge your bets around the level of regulation that could be coming. And so, yeah, it's super important to stay compliant now, focus on that now, because you never know what's going to be coming with that in the future, especially because we're just in such the wild west right now. There's a lot of room for things to go wrong. Um, so that's my first thought. And then also from a development perspective, some of the things that are coming out. One big topic of interest for a lot of people is the idea of explainable AI. Because right now, when you talk to a large language model, essentially all it's doing is just predicting its response one word at a time. That's how it gets its answers. It thinks, what's the most likely word to come next in a sentence? And it's pretty incredible that that is somehow able to formulate what even seems like deep thoughts a lot of times. Like it's really having critical thinking, but it's actually just predicting one word at a time in a sentence. And the issue with that is there's not a lot of transparency behind how the LLM actually got to the output that it did. And so something that a lot of the big companies are researching right now is how they actually tweak their models, maybe even training it in a whole new way to make it so that it can actually explain its reasoning better. So yeah, explainable AI is going to be a huge thing just for risk mitigation in general, because right now, like if AI produces a bad response that has some big impact on a company, like you can't go back and ask it, why did you do it that way? So you can't correct it. But with explainable AI, hopefully that would be a thing. So yeah, that's a big thing. And then also there's a big focus in the industry on LLM monitoring. So solutions like tools like Langsmith and Langfuse are a couple that I know of that are big on just being able, like you have these large language models that are all operating together as what's called AI agents. And so you're orchestrating all these different agents that are essentially like artificial intelligence employees in your business, and like as they're communicating with each other and everything, you need to have visibility into the decisions they're making. And so there's tools out there that help with that. And so that's a big thing that I see like expanding a lot in the future as companies are starting to realize more and more that like when I actually get to the point where my business has a lot of different large language models running a bunch of different processes, I need to know how everything's going. Like this agent talked to this agent 10 times in this way, and then this agent communicated with this agent to do this thing. So yeah, that's going to be really big in the future as well.
Awesome. And I love that you mentioned that explainable AI, just because that's another element there of the NIST AI RMF that they highlight, right? They identified
Hmm.
that too, right? It's even if you have full transparency from the developer side, you still don't necessarily, you can't kind of trace the breadcrumbs backwards as to how it came up with a certain response, or how exactly it's thinking. And that's another thing that's covered there. Again, if those listening are curious a little more about that AI RMF, we've got an awesome page on our website, ispartnersllc.com, as well as a webinar where I get a little more in depth on that as well. So we're just about here at the 10 minutes remaining mark. I did want to give an opportunity for some Q&A. I'm not sure if there's any questions that have been submitted yet.
There are. So, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
So Stefan Petkovic has asked, can AI itself be used to enhance data protection and security measures during the process of building and training AI models while using proprietary and sensitive company data?
That's a great question. Almost like a paradoxical. It's securing itself as it's kind of self-iterating, or building itself, or maybe taking some elements out of its responses or something like that. I have a thought on this. I'd actually, Cole, I think you're maybe a little better equipped if you have any thoughts on something like that. But I'll sprinkle in a thought
Mhm.
here at the end.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so there's kind of two ways that you could take this question. The first way is, can you use AI to assist you in designing architecture that makes AI more secure? The answer to that is like, of course, yes. You can ask the AI, like, I'm creating this architecture. What are some things I should be considering? It can help you as a high level guide in that way to tell you the direction you want to go with developing security measures as you're creating a system. Like it's meta in that way that like AI is trained on developing AI systems. Like it has that knowledge, so it can certainly help you with that. And then the second way that I'm kind of taking this question is like, once you actually have the system developed, can there be a part of it that uses AI to make another part of the system also using AI more secure? The answer to that is also yes. And there's so many different ways that you could do this, and a lot of different examples. One that I'll focus on because it's really simple is we talked about a hybrid approach a little bit, which is like using the black box closed source models for parts of your system, and then models running locally that are running more secure on your own infrastructure. You can combine both. And what I mean by that is you can take a process, like let's say you're uploading PDFs that could potentially contain sensitive data and you want to analyze them. This is a very difficult endeavor. So take this more with a grain of salt, just as an example. You could feed that document into a local model that would then take sensitive data out, like you would train it on how to identify sensitive data. And it would take that out before then sending it to the black box model over the internet. So that way, The local model is the only one that's going to be taking in sensitive data. It's not going out to the internet yet, so it's safe. And then it kind of wipes it of all of that before sending it out. And yeah, I mean, that's a risky kind of example, but it's just something kind of simple and clear to show how you could combine, have a hybrid approach really within like one process.
Awesome. And I don't think there's anything of value I could add to that excellent answer from Cole. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next question.
Okay, awesome. And then I have a question from Cam. Says, if we're building an app that uses AI, are there any current legal requirements or regulations we have to meet?
That's a good question, Cam. I would say that of which I am aware of that are explicitly applied to AI right now, I am not personally aware of them. Now, going back to my earlier point, I think that there's a couple caveats to that. Is one, if your existing information system, we'll call it, the people, processes, technologies that make up a process or a technology or a system, if there are certain compliance requirements that apply to that system, say in the context of a government contract with something like 800-171 or 853, the use of that AI within that system, those controls will have to be applied to that AI system as well, right? So are there existing laws and regulations, at least domestically, that specifically dictate those types of things? I'm not aware of them. It's more so that those existing regulations and those existing requirements probably end up applying to AI anyway when you're using AI in a context wherein they would apply, if that makes sense. And Cole, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there, if you're familiar with anything that you've run into, but that's my response.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think you hit the head on the nail there, Ian.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you. And then I've got a question from Mike Swanson. What kinds of limits or restrictions should a small business put in place for employees? We currently use Claude and ChatGPT, but we don't monitor anything.
That's a really great question. And I think that really the starting point for me is, rather than thinking super complicated immediately, things like a new technology, or do we use a data loss prevention, or do we spend a bunch of money on a new tool to monitor this kind of stuff? Before you get all down that rabbit hole, there's something that you knock out ahead of that. And it's almost like the equivalent of an acceptable use policy, if you're kind of familiar with that concept, is like the AI acceptable use policy. So at minimum, you're educating and socializing to your workforce what your expectations are with respect to those kinds of things. And examples, I think, go back to me and Cole's discussions earlier, where we're talking about, don't put intellectual property, anything with sensitive information, full name, date of birth, personal account number if you're a credit card, right? Listing out the do's and don'ts on those AI systems are not only going to educate your workforce on what is appropriate and what's not, it's also going to give you as an organization something to point to if they do something wrong, and you have to sanction them accordingly, right? Because they could always just say, well, no one told me I wasn't supposed to, and maybe they'd be telling the truth, but they didn't even know they weren't supposed to do X or Y on those platforms. So I think it's a pretty simple way to start, but I think just in the way that phishing awareness training and security awareness training does so much to protect an organization, something as simple as that applied to AI restrictions will actually do a lot for not a lot of money or investment or operational burden. That's kind of my thought on there. It was an awesome question.
Okay.
Cole, I'm not sure if you had any other takes on that.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is that I know a lot of Fortune 500 companies completely block access to generative AI sites like chatgpt.com. And so as you're trying to figure out what kind of training do I need to give to my employees, like Ian said, that's what I've seen a lot of companies default to at first. I don't know. It's not like every business has the capabilities to just like access their employees' laptops with like a software solution like Zscaler, for example, and actually block all of those sites. But if you have the ability to do that, it's definitely something to consider. I mean, employees don't always like it, but sometimes it's necessary because they just don't know what they can and can't do with these models that are just hosted in the cloud.
All right, I've got a bunch of questions still, and we're getting really close on time, so let's try to just do this very quickly.
Sure.
See, limits, restrictions. I had another anonymous attendee that said, what types of AI policies should businesses have in place before introducing AI in the business? And you kind of answered that already.
Yes, I
So
did.
I'm gonna skip that. And then another question from Ellen Messer is, are there any good software packages that can help with ISO 42001 audits or firewall LLMs from outside attacks? And I've got two more questions after that.
Yeah, I think that last one you asked, I think I can answer briefly. Generally in terms of something like 42K1, a lot of the actual clauses and requirements are more so around like the governance side of things, right? So there's so many awesome GRC tools out there where you can kind of lay out a framework or a set of requirements like that and create policies and create bodies of evidence and roles and responsibilities, et cetera, to kind of manage that. And I think just like how valuable those GRC tools are in the context of SOC or PCI or ISO 27001, they'd similarly be applicable to something to like 42001. But I'm not aware if there's any specific like tools out there already, to kind of check the box or meet specific controls within that framework or that standard.
Okay, awesome. We have two more questions if you guys have time. I know everyone's real close on this.
We can rock and roll, and yeah, of course, I'll mention this when I close out. But if there's any follow up discussion or questions, please shoot me an email. Happy to hash it out. But let's keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Really quick. Let's see. I work for a company that deals with PHI. The question I am constantly asking myself is whether or not our developers are using AI in a safe way. What federal and state regulation on the bot calling to B2B? I don't know if what federal and state regulations are there on the bot calling to B2B?
Gotcha. Not
Okay.
sure about the last part of that sentence, but I think generally here you're going to want to look at HIPAA, HIPAA. Obviously, if you're familiar with PHI, you're familiar with that. There are already elements there where there are things like use of test data. Don't use production data in test systems, things like that. I would focus on those types of clauses and requirements and apply those to those developers and just say, hey, I just want to remind everyone here the importance of anonymization, or just use fake dummy data, et cetera. Even if you're you're using AI to develop some of these tools or functions or modules of your solution, right? Because we absolutely cannot be taking PHI and putting it into ChatGPT or really any of our test systems, ideally, because that just raises the risk. And very frequently, the test environments and the QA environments don't have the same security controls in them as the production environments would generally.
And they were saying they mask.
Masking. Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And I think that is everything. And I messed that up. I looked at Alex and then Amin, and I melded them together. So that last question didn't make sense. Sorry, guys. Okay.
All good. Well, just wanted to say, Cole, thank you. You've been a fantastic guest. You certainly opened my eyes and educated me, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. This has been a blast. I've had a great time on this webinar, and I learned a lot from you as well. Because I mean, most companies are not thinking enough about this stuff, and that includes me, honestly. And so, as a consultant, like, I need to be on top of this as well. So this has been great.
Awesome. Hopefully, not our last conversation. And for those listening, thanks again for tuning in here. Again, my name is Ian Terry. I'm with IS Partners. You can find our website at ispartnersllc.com. We will be able to answer all your questions and all of your needs as it relates to IT, audit and compliance, as well as cybersecurity and penetration testing, vulnerability assessment services, and we've got some awesome pages on there specific to AI risk in general, AI RMF, and 42K1. And of course, like I had mentioned, if there are any other questions, or if you wanted to get in touch, you can shoot me an email or reach out via the site, and we'll be happy to take your call and get into it over these awesome topics. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I will be sending out an email with this video. It will have the LinkedIn links to contact both Ian and Cole, and you guys should have everything you need. So thank you so much to everyone for joining.